Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. Today's story is a tale of vulnerable people and a lawyer who took advantage of them. To tell you the truth, they might be among the most vulnerable people in the entire legal system, and the nerve of this lawyer, it's just incredible. Two things to note about this story, sort of disclaimers. First of all, the person that I refer to in this episode as Maria is actually a composite of several people. There was a case study done by a think tank a little while ago setting forth the struggle of certain women, and rather than tell you each of those women's stories individually, I fused them together into one character who I called Maria. It just made the story easier to tell. Second, there are a few victim names that I made up because in the court records the victims are named Victim 1 and Victim 2 to protect their identities, so I just made up some names to make the story easier to follow. As always, I'd love it if you could follow the podcast, rate it, and even leave a comment on the podcast platform where you listen to Good Lawyers Gone Bad. Every bit helps. Thanks very much and enjoy The Destroyer of Their American Dream. Robert loved Rebecca. He loved her for years. Robert loved Rebecca so much that he dedicated almost every moment of the last 4 years of his life to her. And his love for Rebecca only intensified when she reciprocated. Robert Bardo fell in love with Rebecca Schaefer the first time he saw the 21-year-old actress appear on the 1980s sitcom My Sister Sam. He taped every episode of the show, and he'd watch them obsessively. Seeing Rebecca on that show gave meaning to the 19-year-old unemployed loner who once worked at Jack in the Box. Robert soon realized that it wasn't enough for him just to watch Rebecca. He needed her to know how he felt. So Robert sent Rebecca letters upon letters, all explaining how much of a fan he really was. And when Rebecca responded to her biggest fan with a personalized note, he was elated. Or maybe it's better to say consumed. Robert was so excited that he boarded a Greyhound bus and traveled from his home in Tucson, Arizona to go see Rebecca in Los Angeles. She, of course, had no idea that he was coming. When Robert got to Burbank, he rented a cheap hotel room and bought a bouquet of flowers and a teddy bear. His heart was surely racing as he made his way to the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank to present these gifts to his love. But Robert would be disappointed. The security guard turned him away. He was nice about it, though. The guard had seen plenty of fans trying to show their love for actors who worked on that lot. So he actually drove Robert back to his hotel room and told him the same thing that he tells all of the other groupies. Go home, young man, and forget about trying to contact your celebrity crush. Robert did return home, but he was not about to give up on his love for Rebecca. If anything, the whole episode, the idea of getting so close, it all just intensified his love. And that made it even more difficult for him when he saw how she'd betrayed him. Robert saw Rebecca's performance in the film Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, and there was one scene in particular that took his breath away. The love scene. When Robert saw Rebecca with another man, it left him breathless. It left him speechless, and it left him feeling betrayed. Now he really had to find her. Robert's love had turned into obsession, and that obsession gave way to a feeling of betrayal that was overwhelming the young man. He had to let Rebecca know how she'd hurt him. That was the only way that they could possibly make things right again. So Robert hired a private detective who tracked down Rebecca's home address through motor vehicle records. And then Robert got back on a Greyhound bus bound for Los Angeles once again. But this time, he didn't have flowers and a teddy bear. He had a .357 Magnum handgun. When Robert arrived in Southern California, he searched the map for North Sweetser Avenue in West Hollywood. On the morning of July 18th, he found his way over to that address. Inside the home there, Rebecca Schaefer was rehearsing for an upcoming audition for the movie The Godfather Part 3. Robert approached the home, the flip-flops on his feet making slapping noises on the sidewalk as he got closer. The heavy handgun was tucked in his belt, and it swayed slightly with each step. He might have had tears in his eyes. After all, he loved her. He worshipped her. But her disloyalty had been too much for him to bear. Robert knocked on the door. Rebecca trotted through the foyer with the type of bounce in her step that you'd expect from an up-and-coming actress with big career opportunities. And when she opened the door, she was greeted by her biggest fan. And she was charmed. They talked for a few minutes and actually had a nice chat. And when it was over, Rebecca smiled and told Robert to take care. A few moments later, Robert returned. Rebecca answered the door again, and this time she was surprised to see Robert, even a little bit confused. But before she could ask why he'd returned, Robert pulled the gun out from behind his back and shot a bullet through Rebecca's heart. The murder of Rebecca Schaefer was one of a series of vicious acts against women in the early 1990s that received a ton of publicity. It was proof of an epidemic of violence against women, something that women's groups had been shouting about for quite some time. For years, they'd been pressuring Congress to enact legislation to combat the issues of stalking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, but no one felt a sense of urgency. And then, in the early 90s, it was tragedies like the Rebecca Schaefer stalking murder that finally pushed the legislature to take action. That was when Congress adopted the groundbreaking legislation known as the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act is mostly known by its acronym, VAWA. When you hear me say VAWA, I'm referring to that law. VAWA is a comprehensive federal law that provides funding and legal tools that are used to combat domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The law strengthened the criminal justice system by creating victim services and shelters, improving legal protections for victims, and helping those victims of violence escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. The law became particularly important for a certain subset of women, immigrants. Immigrants like Maria Lopez, who found herself in a very difficult position. Maria clutched her 3-year-old daughter Sophia's hand as they walked through the doors of the Head Start program for the first time. It was hot in Texas as usual, but Maria wore long sleeves. She had to. It was the only way she could hide her bruises. Her arm throbbed as she tried to smile for Sophia's sake. A lot of things had changed since little Sophia was born. Maria met her husband Miguel back home in Mexico. He was an American citizen who returned to Mexico for a while, and while he was there, they met, fell in love, and got married. Miguel then brought his new bride back to his home in Laredo, Texas, and it wasn't long after arriving in the States that Sophia was born. At first, Maria had been hopeful about their new life together. Miguel was a U.S. citizen with steady work, and he promised her a better future. But within months of arriving, everything changed. Miguel started to bounce around between jobs, and then money got tight, and all of that changed her husband. The first time Miguel hit Maria was 6 months after they arrived in Texas. She'd been so shocked and so devastated that she called her sister back in Mexico crying. Her sister pleaded with her to leave Miguel. She said, "You need to come home." But Maria whispered back to her sister through the phone, sobbing, "I can't. He filed papers for my green card. He's sponsoring me. If I leave him now, I'll have nothing. And Sophia was born here. She's an American citizen. If I make him angry, he could keep her and have me deported. I would never see her again. I can't risk being separated from my daughter like that." Miguel's troubles continued, and he went from being angry to being paranoid. One particularly nasty argument occurred while the pair was gathering information they needed for Maria's green card application. At one point, he grabbed the application papers from the kitchen table and shouted, "You think you're so smart? I know what you're doing. You're just using me to get your papers, and then you're going to leave me." Maria protested. "No, Miguel, that's not what's happening." But her husband cut her off. "Save the words," he said through a sneer. "I don't believe you." Maria saw the rage growing in Miguel's eyes. She knew she had to do something to calm him down. Wait, she pleaded. "Wait, let me prove it to you. Let me prove that I'm truly here for you, Miguel." Maria took the green card application off the table and tore it into pieces. She threw the pieces all across the floor. "Forget the papers, Miguel. I promise. I'm here for you." From that moment on, Miguel's control over his wife had been absolute. He reminded her daily that she had no legal status, no rights, no way to stay in the country without him. Sometimes he would taunt her during violent outbursts. He'd say, "You destroyed your own papers. Now you have nothing. And if you call the police, I'll tell them about your status. They'll deport you, and they'll take Sofia away from you forever." Maria believed him. She was isolated, she was afraid, and she had nowhere to turn. Her family was hundreds of miles away in Mexico, and she knew almost no one in Laredo. The few times she had considered seeking help, Miguel's threats echoed in her mind. She could hear him saying, "I'll tell immigration you're here illegally. They'll send you back and keep Sofia here with me." But today, the day she brought her daughter to the first day of early education at the government-funded Head Start program, today Maria would be surprised. She was surprised because she found hope. As Maria sat in the parent meeting, the woman from Head Start was presenting information about various community resources. At one point, she said to the group of what was mostly immigrant mothers, she said, "We also want you to know that there are legal protections available for women who are experiencing domestic violence, regardless of your immigration status." Maria's heart began to race. The woman continued, "There's something called VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. It allows women who are being abused by their U.S. citizen husbands to apply for legal status on their own without their husband's knowledge or permission." That was a shock to Maria. Applying for legal status without needing my husband? After the meeting, Maria approached the woman with trembling hands. What you said about that law," she whispered. She was glancing around to make sure no one was overhearing her. "What you said about that law, can you tell me how it works?" Before the Violence Against Women Act, immigrant women like Maria were trapped in a cruel system that gave their abusers total control over their future. Under previous immigration law, immigrants needed a sponsor. Only U.S. citizens and permanent residents could file petitions for their foreign spouses. In cases like Maria's, that meant she needed her husband's cooperation if she ever wanted to become a citizen. Miguel held her legal status entirely in his hands. And that sort of thing happened all the time. Whenever a victim of abuse tried to resist or leave, the abusing spouse could easily use the system as a weapon. All they had to do was threaten to withdraw immigration petitions or destroy documents or call immigration authorities, and the abused woman would have no choice but to shut their mouth and take it. And for women with U.S.-born children like Maria and Sofia, the trap was even more devastating. Leaving an abusive husband meant not only facing deportation, but potentially losing their American citizen child forever. But the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, had a provision that completely changed things. VAWA allowed for something called self-petitioning. Self-petitioning meant that an abused immigrant like Maria could make application for citizenship without a sponsor. If they didn't need a sponsor, they didn't need their husband. And that meant the abused woman did not have to get the consent of her abuser to start the citizenship process. And the critical part of the law was that the abuser would never know. The process was completely confidential. Immigration authorities would never contact Miguel or inform him of Maria's application. And because these women were in such vulnerable situations, the immigration authorities also fast-tracked these type of applications. And just so you know, when the final law was actually created, it wasn't just women that were given these protections. Petitioners could be any gender, and they could be eligible for relief if they were being abused by any family member, not just a spouse. So a parent or a child, whatever. Anyone in that awful situation could avail themselves of the protections under VAWA. But there was still a hurdle for people like Maria. Victims of that sort of abuse still needed help. They couldn't just file VAWA paperwork on their own. They needed someone to champion their cause. They needed a lawyer. They needed a lawyer who would help guide them through the confusing, frustrating world of the United States immigration system. And many women in the New York area found that champion in a man from Africa. In the late 1950s, things around the world were changing dramatically. If you listened to my 3-part series about the Watergate fiasco, then in one of the prequel episodes you learned about Guatemala and Central America in the 1950s and Vietnam in the 1960s. But the upheaval in the world wasn't restricted to those countries. It was a much bigger phenomenon. The post-World War II world was shaking off the yoke of imperialism, and a truckload of countries were achieving independence for the first time in generations. And that was happening beyond places like Central America and Asia. It was also happening in another continent. When Kofi Amankwa was born in West Africa in 1954, there was hope. His home nation was on the cusp of achieving independence from British colonial rule, and they were about to be led by a visionary new leader. The country once known as being the Gold Coast had become Ghana, taking its name from the ancient West African Empire. The black star on its new flag symbolized the hope of African liberation. And their new leader's vision of rapid modernization and Pan-African unity filled the air with possibility. But neither Kofi nor his country would actually fare too well. In fact, they would both suffer great blows in their infancy. For Ghana, it was political upheaval. The country's new leader dreamed of African socialism, but those dreams were crushed under the weight of his corrupt administration, massive foreign debts, and plummeting living standards. Because of all of that, the leader was ousted rather quickly, and for years the country suffered from coup after coup after coup. For young Kofi Amankwa, the upheaval was personal. When Kofi was 3 months old, his parents divorced. He stayed with his mother until he was 6, but then he suffered a cruel twist of fate. Kofi's father demanded that the boy come to live with his father's family. But his father didn't make that demand because he suddenly developed a sense of paternal responsibility. It's not like he woke up one day and said, "I love my son. I want him to come be with me." No, Kofi's father did it for money. If Kofi came to live with his father, then his dad wouldn't have to pay child support anymore. So, Kofi's father dragged the boy away from his mother. Oh, and that wasn't even the cruel part of the twist. The cruel part was that Kofi didn't actually go to live with his father. Kofi was sent to a small village where his father's sisters lived, and he was dumped there. Kofi lived with his aunts while his father lived in a nearby city with his new family. Yeah, Kofi lived in a poor village while his father lived with his new wife and children in a neighboring city. Kofi's father basically abandoned him. He visited his son at most twice a year, and he didn't help him out financially either. When you really think about it, Kofi's story sounds a little bit like an African version of Cinderella. He was a poor boy growing up in a small rural village with ratty clothes. Every morning he would wake up to fetch water from a well far on the other side of the village and deliver it to anybody who was thirsty. He did this every day, in sickness and in health, in good weather and in bad. But despite the miserable situation, or maybe because of it, young Kofi developed a sense of determination. Kofi did well in school, and when he grew up, he attended the Free Methodist College, where he trained to become a teacher. After graduating from Methodist College, his academic excellence opened doors that had probably seemed impossible at an earlier age. He took A-level exams that got him into the University of Ghana, and he was then accepted into Legon University, Ghana's premier institution. In November 1978, he graduated with a Bachelor of Laws degree, a remarkable achievement for a parentless village boy who had grown up without shoes. But as Kofi achieved academic success, his homeland, Ghana, was struggling. By the mid-1970s, the country was experiencing severe economic difficulties. There was inflation, shortages of basic goods, and limited opportunities for even well-educated young people. And that's probably why Kofi Amankwa clung to a dream that seemed almost impossible from this humble village. He wanted to live in the United States. At the same time Kofi was pursuing his studies, he was also planning to escape to America. And eventually, he did just that. On January 24, 1979, at the age of 24, Kofi Amankwa stepped off a plane in New York on a B-1, B-2 business tourism visa. And he didn't waste any time chasing the American dream. Kofi did whatever he had to do to make a living. He worked in a chicken factory, he worked as a messenger, he even worked at a deli counter. He worked hard, got married, had kids, and became a naturalized citizen of the United States. But Kofi Amankwa wasn't content to work a bunch of different jobs just trying to make ends meet. So years after arriving in the country and getting himself established, Kofi applied to New York Law School. He was accepted, he attended, and he got his law degree. Kofi Amankwa was admitted to the New York bar in 1996. So what type of law would Kofi practice? It made sense that it would be immigration. After all, he was an immigrant himself, so he understood the difficult situation that his clients would be in. In immigration law, he could also apply his natural compassion and intelligence to helping vulnerable people traverse a difficult system. So Kofi Amankwa opened up a small immigration law practice in the Bronx. Did you ever think of what type of content goes viral? It's usually content that triggers a strong emotional response, like maybe it's funny or shocking or heartwarming or controversial. And it's that emotional response that makes people want to pass it along to others. And as more and more people share it, of course, the content reaches an exponentially large number of viewers in a very short time. What's crazy is that there's almost no way to know when something will go viral and what will go viral. I mean, if we could figure that out, we'd all have amazing jobs in marketing, right? But we don't know. We sort of get it and we understand the theory, but in the end, I think the planets just have to sort of align all correctly, you know? But when they do, it causes a message to be sent through society like wildfire. In 2016, Kofi Amankwa went viral. And nobody knows why. Until that time, Kofi Amankwa's immigration practice was going, I guess you'd just say it was going. You know, it was going. Amankwa didn't seem to be making tons of money. He had clients and he had what seems to be a respectable practice, but nothing to write home about, you know? But in the year 2016, his practice changed, and it was all because of Mexico. Somehow word of mouth spread throughout the Mexican community in New York that Kofi Amankwa was an effective immigration lawyer. Nobody knows where that started, but it definitely started. And before you knew it, Kofi Amankwa was swamped with Mexican clients who were looking to become U.S. citizens. And one of those people was a guy named Diego Morales. Diego Morales was brought to the United States as a youngster. I don't know the circumstances of why or how Diego left Mexico, but he was 15 years old at the time, so it's likely that as a 15-year-old, he didn't have much say in it. I'm guessing that some family member probably said, "Get your stuff together. We're going to the United States." And that's what he did. And then when he got to the United States, that same someone must have told him, "You're here and you're staying." So he did that too. Diego eventually got married in the United States and got steady work in restaurant kitchens. He always wanted to become a citizen, but it just never happened. There are probably a variety of reasons why he never took steps to adjust his status. That's what they call going from undocumented to properly documented in the immigration world. It could have been because of the language barrier. It could have been because of the fear of being found out as being undocumented. It could have been because he didn't know who to trust in getting assistance, or it could have been all of that. Whatever the reason, Diego just went through life undocumented. He worked, he paid taxes, he stayed out of trouble, he got married, and he and his wife raised 4 children. When Diego's eldest son was an adult, he decided that the time was right to help his father. His son was an American citizen because he was born in the United States, and he was now an adult with a job of his own, so he thought it was time for him to try to sponsor his father. Well, somehow the Moraleses got that viral message sweeping through the Mexican community in New York. Someone told them about a great immigration lawyer who could help. They were delivered to Kofi Amankwa. When Diego reached out to Amankwa, he was greeted with enthusiasm. Amankwa told the Moraleses that he was happy to help them, but it was going to cost them. The lawyer's fee would be $6,000 and the expenses another $1,500. But Amankwa told them that if they retained him, he'd be able to get them the result they so desperately wanted. He was a seasoned immigration lawyer, and he knew the system. Through an interpreter, Amankwa explained to Diego that he would be filing a petition requesting legal permanent resident status, an LPR petition. That's what's commonly known as an application for the coveted green card. Back in the day, when they granted someone legal permanent resident status, you'd get proof of that status by being issued a green ID card. The green card name stuck. Anyway, Amankwa explained that once the LPR application was filed, Diego would receive authorization to work with a valid Social Security number. And there was one more added benefit, which, to Diego, this might have been the best part. Once Amankwa filed the LPR petition, he could also request a travel authorization. That's the document that lets somebody waiting for their application to be processed to travel in and out of the country freely. It was at that moment that Diego probably believed that his lawyer was heaven sent. Diego Morales had not seen his mother in Mexico for over 20 years. There was surely nothing that he wanted more than to travel to Mexico, even if it was for a short time, to be reunited with his mother. It would probably be the highlight of his life. Amankwa told his client that if he could get the money together, the lawyer could get it all done. And he felt confident that he could get it done quickly. To Diego's son, this all must have seemed too good to be true. How could this lawyer be so confident that a green card application would be granted? Wasn't this all a notoriously long and difficult process? Diego's son didn't know much about immigration law, but he didn't think it could be this easy. And how could this lawyer be so sure that he would get results so quickly? It's tough to say what made the Moraleses move forward with Amankwa. Maybe it was because the goal of getting a green card seemed so close. Maybe it was because word on the street in the Mexican community was that Kofi Amankwa was the guy who got things done. Whatever the reason, and with what must have been a hearty dose of both skepticism and hope, the Moraleses moved forward with Kofi Amankwa. Diego and his family scraped together the money for Amankwa's fee. $8,000 is a lot of money, especially if you're a kitchen cook. They also gathered all the documents that Amankwa needed. Both Diego and his son, who was sponsoring him, they both needed to gather a host of information for the lawyer. When everything was together, they brought it to the lawyer's office. Amankwa had all the papers ready to sign. He put the various petitions in front of his client, and Diego signed everything. It all probably felt a little intimidating. Here is someone shoving documents he didn't understand in his face and saying, sign here and here and here. But Diego did as he was told, and after he was finished, Amankwa said that he was sending everything in for filing. The next step was to wait. So that's what they did. It was all they could do. Diego and his family were on pins and needles. They waited for a message from the lawyer day after day. And then, one day, the lawyer summoned Diego and his family to his office. When Diego arrived, he was shocked. Kofi Amankwa handed something to his client. Diego looked down and saw that he was holding a document that said, Official Employment Authorization Card. It was issued by the government of the United States, and it had Diego's photo on it. The lawyer looked at his client and said, You're good to work, and you're good to travel. I can't even imagine the emotions that must have flooded through Diego Morales and the rest of his family at that moment. It is not cliché to say that this was a dream come true. It happened. Diego Morales proudly took his family to Mexico, and they had what must have been the trip of their lives. He was finally reunited with his mother. He brought his family to see the place where he grew up. The entire trip simply had to be a blur. When it was over and they were heading on the plane back to New York, they must have all been buzzing. The time spent in Mexico would most likely be the most memorable in all of their lives. When Diego and his family landed in John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, they breezed through customs. Well, almost all of them breezed through customs. Diego was flagged. To say that he was shocked would be an understatement. He had his documentation in order. He showed the agents his authorization card. He told them, My lawyer told me it was okay for me to travel. He asked them, Why are you doing this to me? But as his family looked on, immigration officials led Diego away for further questioning. Diego was completely in the dark. He had no idea why he was being held. Diego pleaded with the officials to let him go home with his family, but they wouldn't. Something, they said, was not adding up. But Diego couldn't understand what that could possibly be. And then the immigration officials asked Diego a strange question. They asked, Did your son ever abuse you? Diego must have been floored. What do you mean abuse me? The official asked, Did your son ever abuse you physically? He must have responded, Of course not. My son would never do such a thing. And that's when the official must have said, Well then, if that's the case, then it seems you've filed a fraudulent document with the federal government. Diego was paralyzed by confusion. What could he possibly be talking about? What fraud? Right after they asked Diego that question, other officials asked his son a different question. They asked, Is your father's lawyer named Kofi Amankwa? Diego's son was dumbfounded. Yeah, how did you know? And then the Morales family learned what was going on. Kofi Amankwa had indeed filled out immigration petitions for Diego Morales. But what he didn't tell the family is that the petitions for legal permanent residence status were not the type that had Diego's son sponsoring him for citizenship. The document Diego actually signed in his office was a petition under the Violence Against Women Act. The reason Kofi Amankwa was able to get Diego his employment authorization card so quickly was because Amankwa filed a self-petition under VAWA. The document Amankwa prepared and pushed in front of Diego to sign months ago actually claimed that Diego was being abused by his son. By claiming he was being abused, Diego was put on the expedited track for approval. The only problem was that abuse never happened. So when Diego was questioned by immigration officials and he denied that he was being abused by his son, well, then he was contradicting a sworn statement that he made with the federal government. And that's fraud. Diego Morales was sent to a detention center in New Jersey where he was going to be required to explain his case to the immigration court. He did that. He explained what happened. He explained that he didn't know what he had signed. He explained that his lawyer didn't tell him what was actually in those papers. Diego Morales was detained for a month, and after he told the court what happened, they deported him to Mexico. The Morales family tried desperately to get some relief from anyone. They went to the authorities and told them what happened, and it didn't get much to get officials to start to look into things because it seems that Kofi Amankwa had recently been put on their radar. That's why the official asked Diego's son if Amankwa was their lawyer. They were starting to get an inkling that something was up with the guy. But now they didn't just have a blip on the radar screen, they had an actual victim. Officials began to look into Amankwa's operation deeper, and they learned that that word was actually a pretty good description of the Amankwa Law Office. It was an operation. Amankwa apparently had created a bit of a VAWA petition factory, and the Moraleses were far from the only victims. Undercover agents got inside the Amankwa Law Office and learned a host of disturbing details. One of those details was about Amankwa's caseload, the number of cases he had in his office. If you do the math, you realize that for the first 16 years of his practice, from 2000 to 2016, Kofi Amankwa filed about one Violence Against Women Act petition per year. One. That's the way the math works out. One. A single VAWA petition each year. But once his practice went viral, all of that changed. From 2016 to 2023, Amankwa filed 500 VAWA petitions a year. 500. 500 petitions a year, every year for 7 years. And it seemed that almost none of those clients had any idea what was happening. What started as a viral sensation that ran through a community morphed into a devastating parasite that fed off that community. Kofi Amankwa had infiltrated the Mexican community so deeply that he had potential victims lining up to throw their money at him. He couldn't handle the rush of clients. Investigators learned that clients would be lined outside the door of the Amankwa law offices. Some clients even told tales of being forced to wait as much as 11 or 12 hours in his waiting room. They would wait 12 hours until someone from his office would see them. And when the clients finally got to meet their lawyer or one of his lackeys, the law office would go into scam mode. Amankwa would have clients come in with their adult children. He would take copies of their documentation, including copies of the official identification from both the parent and their adult child. He would tell them that he was filling out petitions in which those children were sponsoring their parent for citizenship. But after the clients left, he'd take that information and use it to fill out a VAWA petition. So instead of stating on those documents that the child was sponsoring the parent, Amankwa would file documentation asserting that the child was abusing the parent. He'd bring the families in, he'd shove confusing legal paperwork in front of their faces, he'd tell them to sign, and they did it. They trusted their lawyer. And he wasn't just getting unsuspecting clients to sign documents they didn't understand. In other cases, Amankwa would forge the client's signature. The only way these clients found out about the scam is when they ended up getting questioned by immigration authorities like Diego Morales. And in what appears to be every case, the client would be shocked by the claim of abuse. They'd vehemently deny those claims, and then they'd be charged with fraud. And that was when their entire American dream would be destroyed. Their citizenship application would go down the drain, along with all the money they paid to Kofi Amankwa. Oh, and to make matters worse, as if that were even possible, the client wasn't the only person who would get headaches from this. In many cases, their children had major issues as well. They were also charged with fraud because they had also technically lied on an application. And many of them ran into problems at work because of all of this. Diego Morales' son, for instance, when his employer found out that he was listed as an abuser on federal documents, they launched an administrative investigation to see if they should fire him. Luckily, he was able to explain what happened and he didn't lose his job. As for the rest of the victims, it seems that when the federal government learned the extent of Kofi Amankwa's wrongdoing, they chose not to ultimately charge any of his victims with crimes. Why did Kofi Amankwa do it? What would make what appeared to be a caring person who could easily empathize with his vulnerable clients turn into the kind of monster who destroys their lives and steals their livelihood? No one knows. He offered no explanation when he was finally caught. Of course, we can make a guess, right? Cha-ching. I mean, it had to be the money, right? Think about it. As Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory would say, let's do the math. Amankwa had people lining up to give him thousands of dollars in fees every single day. How much did they each give him? Well, let's look at Diego Morales as an example. He charged Diego $6,000 in fees and another $1,500 for expenses. Let's forget about the expenses because those don't go to Amankwa. Those are for court filing fees and that sort of thing. So is $6,000 per file the right number? All right, maybe not. Investigators learned that Amankwa charged anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 per petition. So let's split the difference. Let's say that he averaged $4,500 a petition. Now, get out your calculator. Over the last 7 years of his practice, Kofi Amankwa filed nearly 4,000 VAMA petitions. At $4,500 a pop, that means that Kofi Amankwa collected $18 million in fees. $18 million. I'm thinking that $18 million is an amount of money that could turn a good lawyer bad. When Kofi Amankwa was confronted with the fraud allegations, he, of course, denied it all. But once it was out there, he knew the authorities were setting their sights on him. But even as the train was barreling down the tracks, heading straight for Kofi Amankwa, the lawyer was still working the angle on potential victims. He was suspended from the practice of law in November 2023, but officials claim that he continued to defraud clients all the way up until they took his license away. In September of 2024, Kofi Amankwa pled guilty to immigration fraud. When it came time for sentencing, the court gave the victims the opportunity to make statements about what Amankwa had done to them and the impact it had on their lives. Diego Morales wasn't there. Now, that's not because he was in Mexico. No, the family was actually able to eventually get Diego back into the States. I'm not sure how they managed that. I wasn't able to find anything in my research. It took some time, but Diego was eventually reunited with his family. Regardless, he didn't appear in court to give a statement at Amankwa's sentencing. In fact, not a single victim appeared in court to speak against Kofi Amankwa. That wasn't because they were reluctant to tell their story. It's because they were reluctant to show their faces. Amankwa's victims were afraid to come to the courthouse. Almost all of the petitions that Kofi Amankwa filed on behalf of clients were ultimately withdrawn for being fraudulent. That meant that all of those clients were still undocumented. So instead of the clients being present, their children showed up and made statements on their behalf. And when they did, the judge sentenced Kofi Amankwa to almost 6 years in prison. Oh, and about that money. When it came time for his sentencing, the court demanded that he return those millions of dollars in fees to the clients who he defrauded. The only problem was, the money was all gone. No one knows where it went. One theory floated at his sentencing was that he sent money back to the country of his birth, Ghana. But there was no proof, and Amankwa wasn't talking. Amankwa was ordered to pay $16.5 million in restitution to his victims, but they're probably not ever going to see a dime. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that story. It's an unfortunate one with a not-so-happy ending, but it's a real story of a good lawyer gone bad. Please support the podcast by rating us and following us and leaving us nice comments. I'd really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to bringing you another story real soon.